5th, 1945. Hitler's been dead for 5 days. The war is practically over, and in an Austrian castle, American and German soldiers are preparing to fight together against an SS division that refuses to quit. This is the Battle of Castle Itter, the only time Americans and Germans became allies in World War II, and the strangest battle of the entire war. It involves a tennis champion on a bicycle, a Wehrmacht officer who switched sides, one Sherman tank nicknamed the Satin Jenny, and a bunch of French VIP prisoners who suddenly had to remember how to shoot. If this sounds insane, that's because it absolutely was. Let's dive into the most absurd final battle of the war. Chapter 1. The Nazi VIP Castle. If someone pitched this as a movie script, it would sound ridiculous. A medieval castle in the Austrian Alps turned into a Nazi prison for VIPs, guarded by SS and surrounded by a collapsing empire. Yet in 1943, that was exactly what Castle Itter became. Not a tourist attraction, but a luxury cage for some of the most valuable prisoners of the Third Reich. Former French prime ministers, generals, politicians, and public figures ended up locked together behind its stone wall. Not because they were ordinary enemies, but because they were bargaining chips. The Nazis even had a fancy label for them. Prominenten. The important ones. Imagine one prison yard where ex-prime ministers who hated each other, career officers, aristocrats, and intellectuals are suddenly roommates, all wearing the same dull clothes and eating the same watery soup. Yesterday, they argued about budgets and strategy in Paris. Today, they argue about who gets the least disgusting piece of bread. Their status bought them a slightly better life than in a regular concentration camp. Real beds, books, newspapers, sometimes even wine. But the price was psychological torture. They knew they were alive only as long as Berlin found them useful. The atmosphere in the castle was surreal. Over breakfast, a former head of government could be trading rumors about the war with a general who once ignored his orders. In the afternoon, they might walk under the gun towers discussing philosophy, while SS guards stared down at them through rifle sights. Every shout from a guard, every unexpected order, every new face on the wall could mean anything. A transfer, punishment, or an execution disguised as security measures. They weren't just afraid of the Nazis outside. They were afraid of the Nazis in the castle, who could decide that witnesses were becoming a problem. By the spring of 1945, the world beyond the walls was disintegrating faster than the Nazi propaganda could lie about. Hitler hid in his bunker. Soviet troops were chewing through Berlin, and American armored columns raced through southern Germany toward Austria. The prisoners heard snippets of news from nervous guards, from smuggled radios, from half-whispered conversations in corridors. The good news, the war was clearly lost for Germany. The bad news, that made their situation even more dangerous. A regime that is dying doesn't usually worry about the safety of its hostages. That fear soaked into every routine in Castle Itter. A guard suddenly more polite. Maybe he's trying to save his own skin. Another one shouting louder than before. Maybe he is ready to go down in the blaze of fanatical glory. The prisoners had no weapons, no soldiers, and no plan. They lived behind thick medieval walls that were designed to keep attackers out, and now looked disturbingly perfect for trapping victims inside. If the SS decided to solve the prisoner problem before the Americans arrived, the castle could turn into a stone tomb in a single day. No one inside those walls could yet imagine that their survival would depend on the most absurd alliance of the entire war. Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers fighting on the same side, on the same ancient battlements, against SS fanatics. But that bizarre finale was still ahead. For now, Castle Itter was just a medieval fortress full of frightened VIPs, guarded by a collapsing dictatorship, waiting to find out whether the end of the war would mean freedom or a bullet in a courtyard with a nice mountain view. Chapter 2. When enemies became allies. By early May 1945, Germany wasn't just losing the war, it was dissolving. The country had fractured into chaos. Entire divisions surrendered without a fight. Officers tore off their insignia and disappeared into the countryside. And SS fanatics roamed the roads, executing deserters on lampposts. In this madness, the guards at Castle Itter simply vanished. One morning, the prisoners woke up and realized the watchtowers were empty, the gates unlocked, and the machine guns unmanned. They were technically free, except they were stuck in a medieval fortress surrounded by trigger-happy SS units who weren't ready to accept that their Führer had blown his brains out in Berlin. The Prominenten had a problem. Freedom without protection is just a different way to die. They needed help, and fast. One of the prisoners, a former French tennis star named Jean Barretra, volunteered for the most insane mission of his life. This guy had once won Wimbledon, and now he was about to sprint through enemy territory like it was a championship match, except the stakes were actual bullets instead of trophies. Baratra slipped out of the castle, jumped on a bicycle, and pedaled through the Alps, looking for American troops. While Baratra was cycling for his life, another bizarre twist was unfolding. A Wehrmacht officer named Major Joseph Sepp Gangl had already decided the war was over and switched sides. Gangl wasn't some Hollywood hero. He was a regular German officer who looked at the burning wreckage of his country and thought, yeah, I'm done with this. He had quietly joined the Austrian resistance and was now helping locals protect themselves from rogue SS units still playing Last Stand of the Third Reich in the mountain. When Gangl heard about the trapped French VIPs in Castle Itter, he made a decision that would have gotten him hanged a week earlier. He reached out to the Americans. Specifically, he contacted Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr., a tank commander whose unit was mopping up resistance in the area. Lee was the kind of officer who didn't overthink things. You tell him there are important prisoners trapped in a castle surrounded by SS fanatics, and his response is basically, cool, let's go get them. Here's where it gets completely surreal. Lee rolled up to meet Gangl with a handful of American soldiers, one Sherman tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny, because apparently even tanks needed to be drunk to deal with this situation, and a bunch of German Wehrmacht troops who had decided they'd rather fight alongside Americans than die for a regime that no longer existed. They shook hands, compared notes, and formed the most unlikely military alliance of World War II. American GIs and German soldiers, who days earlier would have been shooting at each other, were now planning a joint defense operation. Chapter 3. The Siege. One tank against the fanatical division. The SS arrived at dawn on May 5th, 1945, and they weren't there to negotiate. These were troops from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, hardened fanatics who had spent the entire war believing in Hitler's 1,000-year Reich and weren't about to let a small detail like Germany's complete collapse ruin their ideology. They surrounded Castle Itter with somewhere between 100 and 150 men, armed with machine guns, Panzerfausts, mortars, and an unshakable commitment to dying for absolutely nothing. Inside the castle, the defenders did a quick head count and realized just how screwed they were. Captain Jack Lee had around a dozen American soldiers. Major Sepp Gangl commanded maybe 10 Wehrmacht troops who had defected. The French prisoners, former prime ministers, generals, and politicians grabbed rifles and took up positions, though most hadn't fired a weapon since World War I. Oh, and they had exactly one tank, Besotten Jenny, a worn-out Sherman that had seen better days and was now parked in the castle courtyard like a very aggressive garden ornament. The math was brutal. Roughly 30-ish combat-effective troops, one tank, and a bunch of middle-aged Frenchmen with rusty shooting skills against over 100 SS soldiers who had nothing to lose. The defenders' only advantages were the thick medieval stone walls and the fact that the SS didn't know just how pathetically outnumbered the people inside actually were. The attack started with mortar fire. Explosions rocked the castle walls, sending chunks of ancient stone flying through the air. The SS wasn't trying to negotiate or take prisoners. They were trying to demolish the entire fortress and everyone in it. Machine gun fire raked the windows and battlements, forcing the defenders to stay low. Lee positioned his Americans on the walls. Gangl directed his German troops to cover the weakest points, and the French VIPs crouched behind stone pillars, firing back whenever they could. It was the most surreal firefight of the war. A former French prime minister reloading a rifle next to a U.S. Army sergeant, while a Wehrmacht officer shouted tactical instructions in German to American soldiers who somehow understood the tone, if not the words. Then came the Panzerfausts. These handheld anti-tank rockets were designed to punch through armored vehicles, and the SS started launching them at the castle gate. One rocket slammed into the courtyard, the explosion shaking the entire structure. Another barely missed Besotten Jenny, which was firing its main guns at SS positions outside the walls. The tank crew knew they were a massive target. The SS would prioritize destroying the Sherman because it was the only thing keeping them from overrunning the castle. And they were right. A Panzerfaust round finally found its mark. The rocket screamed through the air and smashed into Besotten Jenny with a deafening explosion, disabling the tank in a shower of sparks and shrapnel. The crew bailed out, covered in soot and cursing, and scrambled for cover. Now the defenders had lost their biggest weapon, and the SS knew it. The attacks intensified. Concentrated machine gun fire poured into the castle. Mortars dropped closer and closer to the main gate. The SS were probing for weak points, testing the defenses, waiting for the moment when they could rush the walls and finish this. Inside the castle, ammunition was running low. The Americans were rationing bullets, the Germans were sharing magazines, and the French prisoners were firing single, careful shots like they were back at a shooting range in 1920. Lee and Gangl coordinated the defense, moving troops to wherever the pressure was heaviest, plugging gaps in the line with whoever was available. At one point, a former French tennis star was covering a door with a submachine gun, while a U.S. tank crewman without a tank lobbed grenades from a window. It was absolute chaos, held together by sheer desperation. Then, In the middle of the firefight, Major Joseph Gangel made a decision that turned him from a Wehrmacht defector into a tragic hero. He saw one of the French prisoners, former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, exposed in a window, about to be cut down by SS machine gun fire. Gangel didn't hesitate. He threw himself in front of Reynaud and took the burst of bullets meant for the Frenchman. Gangel collapsed, mortally wounded, becoming the only German soldier in World War II to die defending France's political leadership against his own countrymen. His death could have broken the defenders' morale, but it did the opposite. The Americans fought harder. The German troops under Gangel's command refused to retreat. Even the French prisoners, shaken and exhausted, kept firing. They knew reinforcements were coming. Lee had sent word to nearby American units, but they had no idea when. Every minute felt like an hour. Every lull in the gunfire felt like the SS regrouping for a final assault. And then, just when it seemed like the castle walls would be breached and the defenders overrun, the distant rumble of engines echoed through the valley. American armored vehicles and infantry were racing toward Castle Itter. The SS heard it too, and suddenly their fanatical confidence evaporated. They weren't about to fight a full U.S. Army relief column. The SS began to pull back, retreating into the forests and mountains, abandoning the siege as quickly as they had started it. The Battle of Castle Itter was over. One medieval fortress, one destroyed tank, one fallen hero, and a handful of the strangest allies in military history had held off a division of SS fanatics long enough for help to arrive. It was messy, desperate, and completely insane. Exactly the kind of ending you'd expect for the only battle in World War II where Americans and Germans fought together. Chapter 4. The only American battle for a medieval castle. When the American relief column rolled into Castle Itter on May 5th, 1945, they encountered a scene that looked like it had been ripped from a confused history textbook. U.S. soldiers standing alongside German Wehrmacht troops, French politicians clutching rifles, a smoking, destroyed Sherman tank in a medieval courtyard, the body of a German officer who had died defending French VIPs from his own countrymen, and everywhere the smell of gunpowder mixed with centuries-old stone dust. The relieving troops must have thought they'd stumbled into some kind of elaborate prank. But it wasn't a prank. It was the single strangest victory of World War II, and possibly the only time in American military history that U.S. forces fought a defensive battle for a 13th century European castle. Not in the Revolutionary War, not in the Civil War, not in World War I. Only here, in the final chaotic days of Nazi Germany's collapse, did American soldiers find themselves manning medieval battlements, like knights in a very modern, very deadly siege. The aftermath was just as surreal as the battle itself. The French Prominenten were finally free, but they were also exhausted, traumatized, and still processing the fact that they had survived. Former prime ministers who had spent years as bargaining chips were now shaking hands with American GIs and thanking German soldiers who had switched sides. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion who had cycled through enemy lines to find help, was probably the only person in history to add "survived a castle siege" to a resume that already included a Wimbledon title. Captain Jack Lee, the American tank commander who had agreed to this insane rescue mission, became the hero of a battle that barely anyone knew about. He didn't storm a beach or liberate a city. He defended a castle with a makeshift coalition of former enemies and a bunch of French politicians who wielded rifles like they were handling expensive antiques. Lee would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, though the citation probably didn't fully capture the absurdity of what actually happened. The real tragedy belonged to Major Josef Sepp Gangl, the Wehrmacht officer who had defected, joined the resistance, fought alongside Americans, and died protecting a French politician from SS bullets. Gangl's story is the kind of moral complexity that war movies struggle to portray. A German soldier who spent most of the war on the wrong side realized his mistake, switched allegiances, and sacrificed his life in the final hours of the conflict. The Austrian town of Virgil later named a street after him, a small gesture for a man who became one of the war's unlikeliest heroes. As for Castle Itter itself, it returned to being what it had always been, an old fortress in the Alps with thick walls and a long history, except now that history included one of the most bizarre footnotes of the entire Second World War. The castle stands today as a private residence, its stone walls scarred by bullet holes and shrapnel, a quiet monument to the day when the rules of war stopped making sense and enemies became allies for a few desperate hours. The Battle of Castle Itter doesn't fit neatly into the grand narrative of World War II. It's not Normandy, not Stalingrad, not Iwo Jima. There were no massive armies, no strategic turning points, no speeches that changed history, but in its own chaotic, desperate, completely insane way, it represents something important. A moment when soldiers on both sides looked at the collapsing madness around them and decided that saving lives mattered more than following orders from a regime that no longer existed. It was the only time Americans and Germans fought together in World War II. It was the only American battle for a medieval castle. It was a last-minute rescue, a suicide mission, and an unlikely alliance all rolled into one. And it happened just days before the war in Europe officially ended, as if history wanted to throw in one final plot twist before the credits rolled. The SS troops who attacked the castle melted back into the mountains and were never held accountable. The French prisoners returned home to rebuild their shattered country. The Americans moved on to the occupation and reconstruction of Germany. The German soldiers who fought alongside Lee either disappeared into civilian life or faced the complicated consequences of having served in the Wehrmacht. And Besotten Jenny, the tank that held the line until it was destroyed, was probably scrapped for metal, like thousands of other war machines that outlived their usefulness. But the story survived. Decades later, historians would uncover the details, veterans would share their memories, and the world would learn about the day a medieval Austrian castle became the stage for the strangest battle of the war. It's the kind of story that sounds too ridiculous to be true, and that's exactly why it deserves to be remembered, because sometimes history doesn't follow the script. Sometimes the heroes are former enemies. Sometimes the battlefield is a castle that's older than the countries fighting over it. And sometimes, in the final absurd moments of a war that killed millions, a handful of soldiers decided that protecting lives, even the lives of former adversaries, was worth more than loyalty to a dying empire. That's the legacy of Castle Itter, a battle that never should have happened, fought by allies who never should have existed, in a place that had no business being a battlefield. And yet, it did happen. And the walls still stand. And the story refuses to be forgotten. And that's how one of history's strangest battles ended, Americans and Germans defending a medieval castle together, while French politicians fired rifles like it was 1918. The Battle of Castle Itter lasted only hours, but it packed more chaos than most campaigns. A German officer died a hero. An American captain earned a medal for the weirdest rescue mission ever. A tennis star proved bicycling through enemy lines beats any championship. And one Austrian castle became the only place where enemies decided saving lives mattered more than following a dead dictator's order. Castle Itter still stands today, its walls scarred by bullets. A reminder that sometimes the most important battles aren't the famous ones. They're the small, desperate, ridiculous fights that nobody planned and barely anyone remembered. But they happened, they mattered, and they deserve to be told. If you made it this far, smash that like button and subscribe for more insane World War II stories your teacher never mentioned. Drop a comment on which part blew your mind the most. See you in the next one.